trick. I shall make the salt disappear, or at least diffuse out of my protein solution. So let's talk about dialysis, which is a technique that we can use to get rid of salts and other small things, maybe like EDTA, we're talking imidazole, we're talking DTT, various things that will interfere with your downstream application. So basically what you want to do next with your protein. So dialysis is a way that we can do this using these semi-permeable membranes and taking advantage of diffusion. So let's talk about these terms and then take a look at how we prepare these dialysis tubings, dialysis cassettes, various things having to do with dialysis. And yeah, so it's similar to the dialysis that you would hear about with kidney patients, but I'm going to talk about it in terms of when we're doing a protein purification. First, a real talk overview. So we can and we will get into those technical terms and details so that we know them, but the basic idea is really simple. We have our protein and it's in some sort of solution, some sort of buffer, some pH stabilized salt water. And so it's got our protein and it's got a bunch of stuff that we want and a bunch of stuff that we don't want, maybe like little salts. So basically what we want to do is we put it in a bath, we stick it in a little membrane pouch that the protein cannot get out of, but the little salts and stuff can. So the salts and stuff can go in and out, but the protein is staying stuck. Then we stick it in a big bath of liquid that we want. And so basically this is the buffer we want our protein to be in. So it's often the same buffer, but minus the thing that you don't want. So it's like the same buffer without the imidazole, the same buffer with a lower concentration of salt. Because the basic idea is that what's going to happen is you're going to reach an equilibrium where what's in the bag is the same as what's outside of the bag in liquid wise, but your protein is also going to be inside of the bag because your protein can't escape. So in this way, your protein is going to end up in the buffer that was out here, assuming that everything can diffuse freely through the membrane except for the protein. So now we need to get into those terms, diffusion, and what this semi-permeable membrane actually means and actually is, and how we choose these membranes and all the technical stuff. So let's go. So the basic idea of diffusion is if you have a high concentration of something in one place and it's able to move to other places, and there's another place where there's not a high concentration of it, it's going to move from this place of higher concentration to this place of lower concentration at a net effect, but because of the random movement of particles. So basically, if you have a bunch of something over here and this stuff can move, and things like to move, things like to have freedom. This is the thermodynamic principle called entropy, that things like randomness or disorder or whatever, basically these molecules can move all around. And so if they're moving around and there's a lot of them in one place, they're more likely to move around to a place where there's not a lot of stuff, but there's not a lot of them because they're moving around and they're less likely to wander back and all wander back right back. If they're all moving randomly, they're less likely to randomly move this way and exactly right back. And so if all of them just moved right back, then you wouldn't have this net effect of going to a lower concentration. But because they're all moving randomly, if you start with a lot of people over here and not a lot of people over here, you're going to have a net movement of people from over here to over here, even though you can still have people moving from over here to over here. But a net effect is that you're going to get this movement from the high concentration to the low concentration. And eventually you'll end up with an even distribution about, because now when you have the same thing over here, then you have over here, then they'll be moving both directions. So you reach this dynamic equilibrium, but you're going to have this overall even distribution. And this is the idea behind diffusion. So we can describe it with complex formulas and stuff like Fick's law and see that it depends the flux density, the net movement of molecules over a specific area over a specific time. We can define it with these numbers and this differences in concentration and the distance. But we could describe it with all of these complex terms, but really we're all probably familiar with diffusion. If you've ever stuck some food coloring or some dye, a drop of something colored in a clear solution, now you're going to see that that dye is going to get spread out and evenly distributed. And you'll be aware that if you kind of swirl it, you can kind of give it a head start. And so we'll see these principles come into play when we're talking about dialysis. But when we're talking about when we're looking here, we're talking about this particle can just move all around. So these dye particles, they don't have any barriers in their way. But what if you stick a barrier in their way? Well, now if the particle can't get through, we say it's non-penetrating. If it can get through, then it's penetrating. And so we can have a partition that is, say, just like a solid steel plate or something in there that the dye can't get through, and that would be fully impermeable to it. But if it was, there's like just a huge mesh that everything can get through, it would be fully permeable to it. And we can talk about permeability of both the solute, so the thing that's dissolved, like the dye molecules, and the solvent, so like the water. When we're talking about dialysis, we have a semi-permeable membrane. So it's permeable to some stuff, but not others. So our solvents can get through, so our water can get through, and we have, it's permeable to some of the solute. So in this case, this example, this A, and so this would be like our small little salts that we're trying to get rid of, but it's not permeable to solute B. So solute B would be non-penetrating. And in the case of dialysis, we have that our protein is non-penetrating, but the salts and the solvent are penetrating. And this is why you're going to get the net movement of the salts out of the membrane, but you need to make sure, and your protein is going to stay inside. Of course, you need to make sure that your protein is going to stay inside. You need to make sure your protein is non-penetrating. And you can do this by choosing a molecular weight cutoff that is smaller. It's about like less than half of your protein's molecular mass. And so this is this molecular weight cutoff, or MWCO. So basically, this is talking about the size of the pores in the dialysis membranes. So the dialysis membranes, I'll show you in a minute more about them, but you can have this membranous pouches that we make that I showed you in the beginning, or we can have these like cassettes, and they have different molecular weight cutoffs. Another place we see molecular weight cutoffs is with ultracentrifugal filters. And these are all telling you, okay, well, if your protein is this big, if your protein is bigger than this, then it will be retained. And so I think the molecular weight cutoff, they say for like dialysis membranes, it's typically like 90% of things that are above that size will be retained. But you need to be careful. So first of all, you don't want to lose 10% of your stuff. And second of all, that's like the molecular weight cutoff. Basically, that's just taking into account the mass of your protein. So the combined weights of all of those amino acids it's made up of. So there's about, it's kind of about 10 amino acids per kilodalton. So these values are typically given in daltons. So this is when you have like 1,000, or you see like 20K, so 20 kilodaltons. We typically talk in terms of kilodaltons when we're talking about the protein sizes. And so it's about 10 amino acids per kilodalton. So if you had a 1,000 amino acid protein, then it would be about 100 kilodaltons. If you have a 500 amino acid protein, it would be about 50. Not exact, and the exact is going to also depend on the composition, but you can find the exact one if you care about it using a tool like XPazi-Param. But with any of those, you're just getting the mass and the size of the pore. The pores are also, they're not going to care about like how much it weighs. They're going to care about like how big it is. So different proteins can have different shapes, and this can affect things. So you want to make sure that you are not going to let your protein get through. So you want to give yourself some wiggle room and choose a molecular weight cutoff that's about half of your proteins. But you don't want to just like, okay, I'll go on the super safe side. I have this protein that's 100 kilodaltons. I'll just use a 10 kilodalton membrane. You don't want to do that, because things are going to go slower if the holes are smaller. It's going to be harder for things to get through. You might be familiar with this if you're using a centrifugal filter like I'm doing right at this moment. And my protein is about 40 kilodaltons, and we have either a 10 or a 30, which I'm too scared to use a 30 or a 50. So I'm going with the 10. I really wish we had a 20. But so it's going to go really slow because the holes are really small. So the basic idea with dialysis is that we have our protein solution and we put it in this pouch or this cassette or something like that, where our protein is stuck inside, but the little stuff can flow in and out. So stuff is going to flow in and out until you reach an equilibrium. Problem is, equilibrium, this is dynamic. So just so this membrane, little stuff can flow in, but it can also, little stuff can flow out, but it can also flow back in. So we need to have a lot more liquid outside of the pouch than we have inside of the pouch. So this is definitely not to scale how you would want to do this. So typically you want to have like 200 to 500 times more liquid outside of your outside of the sample. And then you're going to actually change that liquid multiple times, because so if you have a 1 to 200, you have 1 mil and a 200 mil bath, you're going to end up with a 200-fold decrease once you reach that equilibrium. But if you want to get more, you're still going to have like a 200th of what you had before in terms of the stuff you're trying to get rid of. So if you want to get rid of even more, now you need to swap out that bath liquid with fresh buffer. And now you're going to have a concentration gradient again, and the thing is going to move out until you're going to get another equilibrium, but this time it's like 200 times 200, so it's like a 20,000-fold decrease, and you can keep doing this until the thing is almost completely gone. So commonly what you'll do is you'll do like a 2 hours, replace the liquid, another 2 hours, replace the liquid, and then do it overnight. When we're talking about doing protein dialysis, we're often doing it in the cold room. And when you have things in the cold room, things are going to go slower. And so our diffusion is relying on these molecules like randomly moving around. And molecules need energy to randomly move around. And so heat is like a measure of energy. And so if you're cold, then these molecules don't have that much energy. And if they don't have that much energy, it's going to take them longer to move around randomly and reach the membrane and get through the membrane and then travel away from the membrane. So it's going to take longer. And so this is why we need to do it for this long time. We don't want to heat it up because then we're going to like damage our protein potentially. But there are other cases where we can speed up diffusion, such as like if you heat up you're just like doing a chromatography staining, and that's relying on diffusion to get the dye in and get the dye out. And so you can use like microwave steps, a little like heat it up to help drive the process. But you definitely would not want to do that when you're talking about protein dialysis. But what you can do is you can get a little help from convection, so from like physical movement, like moving this water around. And so you can use a stir bar, as I'll show you in a minute. And this way, when the particles get out of the membrane, they're not going to like instantly come back in, they're going to get whipped away, and then it's going to be harder for them to find their way back in. So it's hard to tell when they're like this, but these are actually like tubes. And in order to make them like tubey, we need to get them wet so we can split them open. So this tubing comes in like various sizes and various molecular weight cutoffs. So for example, this one is 45 millimeter and it has a diameter of 29 millimeter, blah, blah, blah. But the important thing too is that it has a molecular weight cutoff of 3,500, so 3.5 kilodaltons. This one you can see is thinner. It's only 25 millimeter flat width, molecular weight cutoff of 12 to 14 kilodaltons. And this one is 6 to 8 kilodaltons, 50 millimeters. So you just basically find one that has a cutoff that is at least half of like the size like you want to. Your protein, you don't want your protein to diffuse out is the big thing. But if you have too small of pores, it'll take longer to diffuse out. It'll be harder for molecules to like get out. And then you also, like the width and stuff is just going to depend on how much you have, how much protein you have. And to basically, you can then use this, there's a little ruler on here, so you know how much, it gives you like the volume per width, or volume per length, sorry. So it's like 2 mils per centimeter for this one, 6.4 mils per centimeter for this one, blah, blah, blah. So then you take how much mils you have, and in order to measure out how big you want the pouch to be, and give yourself a little wiggle room, so that you don't have to clamp it too tight to the ends and then have things spill out. So to make it easier to see, I'm going to use one of these wider ones. So I would measure off how much based on how much protein I have, and then cut out that piece. So right now it is just kind of like stiff, and I wouldn't be able to even like see that it's a tube. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna like get it wet, so you can like stick it in your buffer, and let it soak for a little bit. And so if I was thinking before I did this, I would have it in some sort of like flat dish, so I didn't have to then fish it out later. Sometimes with the membranes, they have things on them that are going to interfere with later uses. So you might need to pre-soak them. Other ones you don't need to pre-soak, and sometimes it depends on whether what your downstream applications are, so what you're doing with it afterwards, and whether the stuff on the membranes is actually going to interfere. When this, after it's soaked for a while, then you should be able to like open it when you move your finger. Sometimes you have to like get a pipette tip or something to help find the crease or find an opening that you can then pry open. So you want to get it wet, and then once it's like wet enough, then you can take it. So we use clamps. I like the clamps. Some people tie, but basically you want to make sure there's enough room on the end so that you don't, it's not too close to the end, because when it swells and stuff, you don't want it to then pop open. And you want to make sure these clamps are really, really tight, because you don't want things spilling out. So like I have had protein spill out with dialysis, and it's a pain, and so I'm like very paranoid when I do dialysis. And so normally what I would do is I would actually be like preparing this. I would have a bucket of ice where I have my protein solution, and then I would have a little beaker in that bucket where I'm actually doing stuff in this beaker, so that when I'm preparing this, when I'm filling the bag, if some spills out or something, then I don't have to worry about losing it, because it'll be caught in that little beaker, and then I can collect it. So now you need to actually make this a bag, and so I'm still trying to find the opening, so I'm going to grab like a pipette tip. Okay, I found an opening. So I found the opening. Now I'm going to open this up and see, it really was a tube. I'm just going to pretend that this is my protein. My protein would be in some sort of tube or something. And then what you're just going to do is you're going to pipette in your protein, and so I would be doing this like in a beaker or something, so that if it spills out, I don't have to worry. And I would just fill this bag with my protein. I just need a little more volume to show you. Don't take your buffer and put it in here. That's like defeating the purpose. Okay, so when you fill this up with your protein, and then what you want to do is now you need to seal it. So you're going to take another clamp, and you're going to seal it. You want to make sure too that you like push down and make sure that it's not going to leak, because leaking is a big problem. And then what you need to do is you need to get it so that it can float. So they have like flotation devices, little floaties that come with these. So like these, and then these can slip on to these clamps. Because you want this to float in the liquid. You don't want to be like fishing it out later. This might not be the right size one. Okay, and so now it'll float, and you'll see that I also have a stir bar in here. So I have my sack has a much lower volume than the liquid, so that it is going to, things will diffuse out. I'll have a big like concentration difference, and then I do the stir bar. So I put this on a stir plate, because that's going to help. The convection is going to help, because you're basically, when the molecules are diffusing out, they can kind of like hang out around the membrane and kind of like clog it up. So when you're adding when you're spinning it, you're helping kind of move those particles away, where they're less likely to come like find their way back in. So you make it so it's kind of like you're making them get lost. If you just kick them like right outside the door, they could easily come back in. But if you kick them like far away, then it's harder to come back. And so you put this on a stir plate and let it stir. And this is going to help. So then after a couple hours, you would change into a new buffer. A couple more hours, you change into a new buffer, and then you typically leave it overnight. That's like the basic overview of how you would go about one of these dialysis. So I tend to use these tubes if I have a lot of liquid. If I have less liquid, then these dialysis cassettes are really nice. These like Slidalyzer, that's like their brand name or whatever. But basically they have these little like windows, these membrane windows. And you actually take a syringe and they have little holes and you inject your sample into here. And then you suck out air and then you let it do its thing and then you pull it out like the other side. But what's really nice about these is because they have these windows, they're maximizing the surface area to volume. So there's more spaces where the molecules can hit the membrane and leave. So, and I like working with these because they're a lot less risk that they're going to like break open or stuff. The other thing that scares me about these pouches is like when you're taking it open. So everything goes well during your dialysis, but now you come to take it open and now you want to be doing it over a beaker or something too, because when you open it up, sometimes when you're trying to take the stuff out, then it spills out. And yeah, true story. And you don't want to be spilling out into your dialysis buffer. You want to pour onto the ground or something. You want to be spilling it out into some safe container. So just have your capture plan in mind. And so these dialysis cassettes, though, they come in a variety of sizes and molecular weight cutoffs. Obviously, these are going to be more expensive than like the tubing, but if you have a smaller volume, it can help, because another thing with these is you're going to probably lose more when you have it in one of these pouches where you're likely like spilling a little. It's hard to get everything out, or at least me personally. So if I would have a smaller volume, I would use one of these. My protein is more expensive than the cost of losing my protein would be more pricey to me, or to the lab, than the price of one of these. Speaking of small volumes, if you have a really small volume, they have these like tiny little guys that are really cute. And they have, you can see they've got this little tiny membrane on them. I guess you probably can't see in the video, but they have a really tiny little membrane on them. So we used to make these ourselves, kind of thing. Like you take an Eppendorf and you put a hole in it, and then you put a membrane over the top and like wrap it up. If you have a really small volume, but these are a nicer way to do it. So we have a lot of different sizes in addition to the tubing. You can see like we have a ton of different sizes of these membranes with different size weight, like different molecular weight cutoffs and different capacities. And so really it's just going to depend on how much liquid you have and what it is how big the thing that you want to get rid of is, or things you want to get rid of is, and how big the thing that you don't want to get rid of. So like your protein, how big is your precious protein? You want to leave a little room, like a little air in there though, to account for osmosis. So basically the idea that water can be flowing into your bag. And so osmosis is talking about when we're talking about the movement of a solvent. So in this case, it would be like the water part of your buffer. And so now you can think about kind of water concentrations. So in terms of the water concentration, you would have more of it in the side without a bunch of solute, whereas in the side with the solute, now if you were to go and you were to grab some molecules, you would have fewer water and more solvent, if that kind of makes sense to you. So this is one of these like colligative properties, which depends on the number of particles and not the identity of the particles. So often when we're talking about osmosis, we're talking about when the solute can't get through, but osmosis can also happen when the solute can't get through. But if the osmosis is happening faster than the solvent is getting out, basically what can happen is you're going to have water flowing into your pouch likely. And this water is going to be flowing into your pouch potentially faster than your stuff can be flowing out. And you could have your pouch start to swell. And when your pouch is swelling, if you don't have enough room in the pouch, then the pouch can burst. And this is not a good thing. So we do not want this to happen. Tonicity is like comparative term, and it's comparing the amounts of non-penetrating solutes and predicting the flow of solvent. So it's not a value, it's like a comparative term. So we can say some things like hypotonic if it has less, so hypo below, hyper over, iso don't care, they're the same. And so we can say that if something has more non-penetrating particles, it would be hypertonic, and you're going to get solvent moving towards it. If it's isotonic, then you have the same amount of non-penetrating particles on either side. So the solvent is just, I mean, it's still going to go back and forth, but it won't, no net change. And if it's hypotonic, that means fewer non-penetrating particles, then the water can flow out of it. You can also kind of like flip the script and take advantage of tonicity to concentrate your sample using dialysis. Here, what you need is you need to have a higher concentration of non-penetrating solute outside of the bag. So even though you have stuff inside the bag that you want to get out, you also can add stuff outside of the bag that can't get in. And if you add more stuff outside than there is stuff inside, then water will come out of the bag and thus concentrate your sample. So you need to add something though to make sure that it's not going to go through the bag. So you can add something big, like some sort of big polyethylene glycol that can't get through a peg or something. So people can use this as a way to concentrate proteins. Just a note about some of the times that you might want to use dialysis. So if you are doing if you're doing some sort of chromatography, you often, so when we're separating proteins based on different properties, by sending them traveling, a mixture of proteins traveling through these columns filled with these little beads called resin. And these beads have different properties that are going to interact differently with different proteins, and therefore proteins are going to flow through differently, and we can separate them based on things like having a specific tag, like a his tag or a strep tag, based on their charge or based on their size. And when we're doing an affinity chromatography, we often do these like stepwise, so we can go from like affinity to ion exchange to size exclusion. When we're doing affinity chromatography, here we're going to be competing things off. And so, for example, if you were doing a his tag purification, you would be competing it off with a lot of imidazole. Now, imidazole, and sometimes you often want to cut off the tag. Now, imidazole can inhibit some of the tag cutters, so it can like inhibit TEV protease. So if you have a lot of imidazole that you use to push off your protein, well, now it's gonna inhibit you cutting off the tag unless you get rid of imidazole. And you can get rid of imidazole with dialysis because imidazole is a little tiny thing. And so this way you can then remove that so that you can do your tag. And you can actually do the dialysis while it's cleaving. So what I've done in the past, so I think in the picture when I was doing it here, what I'm doing is in my pouch, I have the protein from the his column, and I've added TEV protease, and now I'm dialyzing it against this buffer that's the same, but it doesn't have the imidazole, and so now the imidazole is going to be flowing out, and my protein is going to stay in, and it's going to get cut without having the imidazole disrupting things. You can also, if you're doing a tag cleavage where you don't have like a fusion partner, so if you don't have like a sumo his or whatever, if it's just a his tag and you want to take it off, often people leave the tags on when it's just a short little tag. But if you wanted to remove it, well, the his tag, it's only like 8 amino acids, so it's only going to be it's only going to be like like a kilodalton or something, so that can easily come through. Most of these molecular weight cutoff membranes are typically higher than that, and so you can actually remove the tag that way. When you're doing ion exchange chromatography, here you're going to be competing things off with salt. You might have more salts than you want for further uses, and so if you're just stopping here, then you could use dialysis to help get rid of the salt. But an alternative is like just if you do size exclusion chromatography, here it will get rid of the salt basically because it'll you can use it as a sort of buffer exchange because the protein is going to be coming out of this column with whatever was in the beads, whatever you equilibrated the column with. So you equilibrate the column with the buffer that you want. And now when your protein comes through, the buffer, because the smaller things travel slower. So your beads are going to have the buffer that was in there when you equilibrated them, and your proteins are going to flow out with that, not with what they came in with. And so this way your protein is going to elute or come off the column in the buffer that you have in the column. And so you can use this for buffer exchange. You can also use, so instead of doing like this dialysis, you can do it this way. And I much prefer this way because I really hate dialysis. But basically, yeah. But you do have to concentrate it after the ion exchange before you do the size exclusion chromatography. Other times you might want to use dialysis. There can be other things like EDTA. So if you have a protein that is going to need metal and you have EDTA in there, or EDTA can also interfere with some other downstream applications of some things you want to do with your protein. There are a variety of different salts and various incompatibility issues that dialysis can help you get around those incompatibility issues by removing those little things that'll interfere with further steps. Sometimes you use dialysis when you've made a boo-boo. So with affinity chromatography, another common form is the strep tag, and you can pee it off with this thiobiotin. As I was telling you about in yesterday's post. And as also I mentioned in yesterday's post, one time I messed up and I accidentally added the buffer with the competitor, so my elution buffer, when I meant to add the wash buffer, so the buffer without the competitor. And so now my protein came off, but my protein came off with everything else. And so now I wanted to redo this, but now my protein has the competitor in it, so it's not going to bind. So I used dialysis to get rid of the thiobiotin, so then I could reload my protein onto the column, and voila.